Everybody. Yeah, it's after lunch, so time to burn off some calories. So let's have everybody stand up again. Thanks, Chris. That was a great idea. Look at it this way. You burn off a few calories, you're going to get more for your drink tickets. So sit down if you've never played a game before. A very boring childhood. Okay, sit down if you've never made a game before. All right, that's good, that's good. All right, if you're sitting down, stand back up. Now, it's my +1. Now, sit down if you have never played a VR game before. Sit down if you've never played an HTC Vive or Oculus Touch game before, i.e. the latest gen. Yeah. And now, of those of you left standing, sit down if you've never made a game for any of these devices before. All right. Now look around. So my talk today is about VR and game design in VR, and it is very much, everyone can sit down now, about being on the frontier. So it's really hard to kind of come up with the ideal things to talk about in this context because so few of us have actually been producing content in this space, and so few of us have actually had the opportunity to truly experience these devices. If you have, we like to joke about there are those that have tried the HTC Vive or the Oculus Touch and those that haven't. It really is a huge divide. VR is not something that you can simply talk about and expect people to understand. It is extremely experiential. But there's one key lesson. If you take nothing away from my talk today, I would like to hearken back to the early moments of our conference today when the wonderful Justin Smith pointed out. I don't know where Justin is. I can't really see a thing, but thank you, Justin, for those pearls of wisdom. So don't forget your Z. I'll translate for the Americans, Z. Very important. And you'll notice my tribute minimalist slide as well. It's about to get a little noisier. So I'm working on a little VR game with a group of amazing people, some of my bestest friends in the whole world, called Fantastic Contraption. Thank you. You may remember a Flash game back in, I think it came out 2007, 2008. It's a physics-based puzzler, then 2D, now very much with Z in it. And it's a collaboration between Northway Games, Radial Games, and Power Up Audio, which I don't know actually why I didn't put that up there, but sorry guys, I love you. That's why I wore my Bruce Lee shirt. You won't mess with me. So that's me. So I'm Kimberly Voll, or Zany Tomato, as people tend to call me. My background, I'm first and foremost, I guess, a cognitive scientist. So I pay attention and I work with how we have experiences. And I've spent many years, probably, close to 20 of them now, trying to come to understand what goes into experiences, how our brains work, how our minds work, and doing so from a perspective of interactive experiences and very much from games. I've been making games for a really, really long time. I also have a PhD in computer science and in artificial intelligence. I just do stuff. I wasn't trying to brag. Jeez Louise. So we're working on Fantastic Contraption. This is, as I say, it's very hard to capture it, so it's definitely something you're going to want to try. But you can see, I hope, that there is a little physics puzzle space there, and you have a bunch of little tools in your toolbox. We are AKA the farting cat team. So Neko the cat is actually our toolbox, and you have some rods and you have some wheels, and you have a ball, the goal of which is to take that ball on your very fantastic contraption to the pink spot in the background there. And you can see our lovely model for today is the wonderful Andy Moore. And there you can see the hand devices and all of the rig, which Zach did a great job of demoing earlier, so I'm not going to go into too much details there. But let's talk for a moment about what is VR, other than easy to spell. So virtual reality is any kind of device or setup that seeks to basically trick your brain into thinking that it's in another spot or that you're having an experience that is removed from reality. And there's lots of different ways that we can do this, but the stuff that we're most familiar with is where you throw on a headset. There might be some degree of room tracking, hand devices, etc. I'm not going to go into the detail, but for those of you who are interested, virtual reality has an extremely long history that far predates our last 2-3 year explosion of soon-to-be commercial VR technology. It started its first stirrings in and around the 50s. I love that picture. Sorry, it's low res. I've never been able to find a high res one, and I've stolen every picture in here except what came from our game. Sorry. So reality is fake. Now, why would I say that? We're all here right now. We're all very much here in all senses that I can think of. But bear with me for a moment. Close your eyes. Everyone close your eyes. Now try to imagine as hard as you possibly can that you're anywhere other than here. I know, the talk's not that terrible, but bear with me. I'm going to not talk for a second and just try really, really hard. Pick here, Hawaii if you don't have a spot there. Now everyone's got a spot. Now just try really hard to be there. All right, come back. So, did it work? Yeah, no, sort of. But I mean, you weren't really there, right? There were so many different things that was giving your brain all sorts of interesting information to tell you that, no, your ass is here. You were sitting here. In fact, your ass was telling you that. You got your whole proprioception system, your vestibular system, took away the visual cues, but still there's all of the things that form a coherent sense of place and presence, and this notion of a sensory fusion that brings it all together. But luckily, our brains are very gullible. What? Our brains are very gullible. So because of this sensory fusion and all of these pieces that are contributing to our sense of being in the world, it gives us this cornucopia of opportunities for us to tap in and try to create experiences that exist outside of the real world. And in fact, I'll even go so far as to say that the reality that we are experiencing right now is just what our brain decides to serve up as reality in the moment. And we have lots of examples of this where people have been in the same spot, witnessing the same event, and they come away with different stories from it. Part of that is because memory is very fallible and malleable, but part of it is because experientially people are actually having different realities evolving in front of them. Now, I can't go too far without briefly mentioning the thing that people always bring up when we talk about VR sickness. So VR sickness is a real thing. It's when you get sick in VR. But the one thing I can tell you, working with the HTC Vive and all of the leading edge technology, is that VR sickness has moved from being a hardware problem to a developer problem. In other words, if you want to work in VR as a designer, the first thing you have to own is that if your players, if your audience are getting sick, it's your fault. You're messing it up now. We have a pretty good sense of the things that make people sick in these spaces, non-natural movements, jitter, all of these different things. And there's no reason. The hardware now can produce content at a rate and a fidelity that supports a completely non-nauseating experience. The other piece to keep in mind, and this was referenced briefly earlier when Zach was talking, is this notion of room scale. So it's an interesting shift because prior to now, if your game wasn't meant to run in a particular context, it was limited by the hardware itself. It came out on the hardware it was intended for. But now we have hardware coming out, the HTC Vive, for example, that is room scale VR. It's not room scale required VR. So while it extends the space and provides a lot of really, really interesting opportunities, it doesn't necessitate that you need to be getting up and moving around. And that's very important because it means there are a breadth of opportunities for us as designers to explore that range from a seated, more still experience, a standing experience, moving around in a smaller space to a larger space. And that's very challenging because we can't just rely on our consumers to be able to filter that appropriately. So we're going to have people, for example, that are bashing around in their living rooms that are too small because they're trying to run content that was designed for something else. And I've seen a lot of that. I've probably run now hundreds of VR demos, and I've seen people doing all sorts of crazy things. So it's an important consideration as we go forward. All right, that crazy buzzword, presence. Who here's heard the word presence before? Yeah. Who here had heard the word presence before like 3 years ago? Yeah, a couple people, yeah. So it's pretty much the VR buzzword. And for those of you who know me, I tend to prattle on about presence a lot. But in short, that is the pervasive sense of being somewhere. It's a mediated experience that does not feel mediated. And it's produced as a result of all of these inputs that your brain is receiving, ranging through, like I said, the proprioception system, the more traditional vestibular system, you know, where you are in the world, the effect of gravity on your body as a consistent input. We can generate presence in non-VR, to be clear. A lot of people said, oh, this is this magic thing for VR. No. You can feel you are in a lot of places in a lot of different ways. It's a matter of tricking the right systems at the right time and enough of them so that that becomes the predominant reality for your brain. But it's much, much harder when you can pull in the visual system and have it be responsive to you looking around in the space, as we can now in VR today, and similarly, as Zach made reference, it also gets better when you can move fully around in that space. It gets a little bit easier, but only a little bit. So whereas people will throw on the rig and be like, whoa, cool, this is really neat, I'm in VR, I'm in this other space, I have presence, I know this word. You probably have a little bit of it in the moment, but as you acclimate to that experience and the novelty wears off, that notion of presence actually starts to melt away. And while this isn't going to be a talk on presence, one of the points that I want to make is I know everybody talks about it and they talk about it like it's the coolest thing. The coolest thing is VR. Presence is one aspect of it, and you can have fantastic experiences in VR, and we're going to design them that don't necessarily have full presence. Some will, some won't, but don't use that as the hallmark of a quality experience. So, yeah, you know what drives me nuts actually is look at how tall that screen is compared to, that's totally unrealistic. So we've spent the last 40 plus years trying to figure out how to close that distance between the screen and the player, right? All of our experiences are mitigated through controllers. And what this means is that as designers, we have incredibly intense availability bias. It's not that VR is constrained, it's that VR is constrained by the limits of our imagination. We just haven't had the opportunity to think and explore in this space, and so we're going to do what's natural. We're going to take the things that we are most familiar with designing, so through controllers, mouse and keyboard, all of these things that we're used to doing, and we're going to filter, largely unconsciously, all of our ideas through this as we form them for VR. So we're going to be our own worst enemies as designers for a long stretch. Excuse me. So think, for example, a great example of this is mobile. Think how long it took us to get better at mobile, right? Cramming a D-pad on a mobile device, like that was a thing for an embarrassingly long time. Now, of course, obviously it's idiotic, but at the time, we had never worked with a touch-based interface like that before. We just didn't have any tools. We hadn't evolved a language for how we operate in this world. And that's where we're at with VR today. It's incredibly exciting. It's an opportunity for us at the frontier to define what the next generation of content developers in virtual reality will be doing, the tools that they will work with, the things to which they default as designers and developers for operating in this space. We are in that right now. We are creating that. It's incredibly hard, though, to fully appreciate how much we take for granted as designers. So take, for example, our farting cat. The farting cat is a menu, right? It's really just a menu. But we had a hard time coming to that because we're used to designing menus and UIs in very particular ways. We're used to considering these things through the filter of the input devices that we use without thinking about, right? We click, we scroll, we tappity-tap, we have buttons, we have triggers, we have all of these things. This is our natural language of expression that we continually default to. But in 40 years, what we haven't had is move around, grab things, do things in a very natural human way. We consciously or unconsciously mostly these days, especially for those of us who have played a lot of games, and I've been playing games for 35 plus years now, we unconsciously adopt all of these behaviors that are reflections of the tools that we use. And in doing so, we carry through, again, those biases into what we design. One of the key points when you are creating any kind of virtual reality experience is that VR is first and foremost about trust and creating a safe space. We had Colin up here in the rig on a stage with everyone staring at him with a potential death drop here in front of him. He's a good sport. He's very good at it, moving around. He's also very accustomed to VR. But for somebody that's not been in that space before, no one has to put a hand up. But think for a moment, whether novelty aside, how comfortable you would have been coming up here on stage and putting on something that asks you to forget the fact there's 200 people staring at you. It's incredibly difficult. It's incredibly difficult with one person standing there, with one developer standing there who's observing you. So you get into these quasi-weird states where instead of giving in to the experience, we find that people are actually holding a representation of the real world that is arguing with their ability to get immersed into their current experience. And for us as a developer, that's a really shitty way to play test. We're not actually getting an opportunity to feel out what it's like. One other added point to this also means respecting phobias. So that's you guys, Valve, with, you know what I'm talking about. Don't mess around with people's phobias. The intensity of the experience in VR is 100-fold more than you might imagine. And just because you're okay with it does not mean somebody else is going to be. So if you think this is a red flag moment, don't get all caught up in, but I really want them to be surprised. Respect and create those safe spaces. One of the other points about being observed is it's not simply the distraction, it's that some people will actually insist on not letting go. So when you first put somebody in a VR experience, it's awesome. There's what we call the VR giggle. They throw on the rig and they giggle. Like it's so visceral and so immediate and so delightfully childlike that in that moment, your faith in humanity is deeply restored. It's wonderful. It's an absolutely wonderful moment. But there are people who, for whatever reason, they're a little uncomfortable. They're not the sort that gives in to experiences because that's a certain degree of vulnerability, whether they're called as such or not. They just won't let go. I do a similar thing when I go to horror movies. I like to be all like, yeah, look at me, I don't get scared in horror movies. But that's not fair, right? I'm being unfair to the creators of that content, because that content is genuinely scary, startling, etc. Insert your favorite subgenre within horror. But I do things like I intentionally block my immersion. I start thinking about a grocery list, I look away at key, I do all of these little tricks that will prevent me from jumping. And then my friend's like, oh, wow, you didn't jump at all. I'm like, yeah, that's right, I didn't. But I'm cheating the entire experience. So people do that in VR too. What bothers some people in VR may not bother others. So I'll talk in a moment on a list of things, but just keep in mind that as a developer, you're going to acclimate to a lot of things, and you might start out naturally comfortable with things. But this doesn't mean you should carry that assumption into your broader audience. So keep that in mind. When working on Fantastic Contraption, we found a number of things that people don't like, comparably with showing a lot of other demos as well. One of the things is moving through you. It's a very disconcerting and unnatural concept. Even if you don't need to model the body as a whole, it turns out that, IK and all of that stuff just creates lots of opportunities to mess people up. Keeping people's hands is really important. But having things move through where you otherwise would expect a body is uncomfortable. things flying at you, being moved in the space. That's like, a one-way ticket to don't mess with that. Spawning in the middle of something. So you actually don't have near as much control in VR in many respects. All of those tricks for nudging or just flat out not letting the player go somewhere, you can't do that. You can't just spontaneously spawn colliders in the space unless you can, make your coffee table bend to its will, and then you have players walking into things. But the cool thing is our brains will naturally contribute to much of the illusion. So we will actually avoid, typically, this isn't 100%, so don't, design with that in mind. You will have exceptions to all of this. But we will typically avoid walking through things. So there's a counter in Job Simulator that most people just stay behind, because that's what you do with counters. This little experiment here, one of these hands is obviously fake. Hopefully I don't need to explain that. And they take a brush and they paint up and down the fake and the real hand, back and forth. And this cleverly placed towel, it makes eventually, after a fashion, the lady sitting there her brain starts to unconsciously lose track of which hand is hers. The other one has a galvanic skin response, and in the next scene, they take an ice pick or something through the hand. And you react just like it's your hand. It scares the shit out of you. So that means we can actually offer science, man. You should hear what they do. Oh, anyway, science, man. It's crazy. So that means that we can actually get a lot more out of what we're doing, because we are able then to create opportunities for people to feel that they are actually extended into their worlds without being extended into their worlds. That is really, really cool. When we see people building contraptions in their space and then stepping through them and ducking around them, that is an incredibly rewarding and interesting experience. And it's a very interesting experience as well for us, as we, the developers, have spent so much time in these games, and we do the same things. So there's certain things that your brain's just going to help you out with. But to that end, I talk a lot about this notion of a fidelity contract. So as creators of content, the fidelity at which we produce that content holds us to a contract with the actual player. In other words, if we produce something at a particular level of fidelity, that creates expectations in that player for how that fidelity is maintained throughout that experience. So if you create a giant candy-like red button that I can push in my environment, and another giant candy-like green button next to it that I can't, I'm going to feel ripped off. Whereas if these buttons had never been interactive to begin with, that's a consistent experience and it's okay. So in Fantastic Contraption, we spent a lot of time thinking about this, thinking about what creates a cohesive experience and what people just naturally were going to do in these spaces. So rather than sign ourselves up for a huge fidelity contract that we knew we couldn't uphold, and partly because of the team size, but mostly because of the limits of the technology and the nature of the game that we were creating and how that would interfere with what we were attempting to do, we set ourselves a goal of a more cartoon-like experience at a lower fidelity with minimum pieces. And then we've just had people spend a lot of time in here and see what they do. And from that, we've collected a lot of lessons. One is people throw things. We didn't have throwing in the game, but people were grabbing things and they were holding it, and then they threw them. And they threw things so consistently that we added it to the game. And it feels great. People haven't stopped throwing things. Now they just actually get a reward. And it doesn't feel like, whoa, holy shit, throwing in a game. It's just, yeah, that's right. This world is consistent in the way that I expect it to be consistent. So it's a smaller little brain rush, but it still exists there. The other weird thing, Zach mentioned this too, people don't look around. So we have like a sign pop up and leaves blow into your face and this incredible audio crescendo, and people are like, what do I do next with the instructions behind them? People aren't used to moving around in their games. This is what we're used to. Remember when the Wii came out? Yeah, some people gravitated toward it and were doing this, but how quickly did it reduce to this, right? I'm so good at bowling. So in VR, it's a similar type of thing. You've got to incentivize people. You've got to give them a comfortable spot and give them time to acclimate to moving around in a space that they've never otherwise had the opportunity to move around in. Pulling things apart, stick things together, whoa, poof, oh shit, that worked. As soon as we saw people doing that, we're like, we gotta get that in there. interacting with elements. Well, it turns out while you can't make people do the things that you want them to do, you can encourage them greatly if you're clever about it. So we actually have a little fly in the environment that will fly around. We haven't decided exactly what we're doing with it yet, but the cool thing that we've noticed is as it flies around, what do people do with flies? So we get a fairly consistent response to something in the environment. Neko, or farting cat. So you can actually call him by double-clicking the trigger. And that came about because somebody in the environment, he was like, oh, man, look at the cat. Click, click. And he came. So we added that. And one of my final favorite points is you can actually scratch his chin, and he responds now. The last big thing that we added was just to be able to move the whole contraption, which turns out to be really useful. People are building, and they just naturally go thoink, thoink. So we added that too. So all of this is kind of like a wandering through VR, and like I say, not a lot of people have a lot of connection points. But the number one thing that I can tell you, your big takeaway, aside from don't forget the Z, is that you need to start really simple. You and your players need to spend time in this space, as much time as you possibly can, because it is nothing like what is on a screen. And what you might create tapping away on your computer here, that experience of it in the rig will be completely different. You need to know the perceptual gaps and the affordances and hidden affordances of that space that you create. Thank you.